Welcome. Good morning, everyone, to the Chicago Community Trust. We are celebrating close to 1 year in our new building. So if you've been to the Trust on 225, welcome to our new offices here at the 00 coordinates of the city. We are so excited to have this panel discussion in partnership with Public Narrative. I'm here to introduce myself, to tell you a little bit about the Trust, and then we're going to keep the conversation going. In 2019, if you're not familiar, the Trust launched a strategic, we relaunched our strategic goal of reducing the racial and ethnic wealth gap and introduced an integrated strategy to help us get there. The continuation of our evergreen work of addressing critical needs of our region, coupled with making a focus on catalyzing neighborhood investment, growing household wealth, and building collective power. Our journalism and media work is situated within our Building Collective Power strategy, and all of this work is supported by a policy agenda because we understand that we can't achieve this ambitious goal or even pursue it in the correct way without having a policy agenda to support our grant making and our programming. Building Collective Power is situated with three pillars: people, voice, and action. And we really think about how do we create the conditions so that we can pursue this goal of reducing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. And we know the role of journalism, media, narrative is important in allowing us to do so. I'm going to turn it over to introduce our new leader of Building Collective Power, Iona Calhoun Batiste, who is replacing Daniel Ash, who's here on the panel, so that she can say hello and welcome.
There's no replacing Dan Ash, as he is amazing. So, but I'm just so happy I got to step into a role. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Iona Calhoun Batiste. I am the new Senior Director of the Building Collective Power, and I am really excited to be here. I welcome you all to this very, very important discussion around a really interesting topic and really elevating the understanding of how boys and men of color are represented in the media. This is a work that is near and dear to me, as I was very interested in this work in my previous organization, and to see it come full circle and be here today and hear the amazing important facts that are elevated in this report are very, very important and extremely meaningful to me. So I just welcome you all. I want to give another round of applause to Lauren, who has really been leading and spearheading some of this work here at the Trust, along with Dan. And I just want to thank you all and thank you for being here.
I want to introduce Jamira Alexander, who's the Executive Director. Jamira.
Thank you all for being here. So the story of us, Public Narrative and CCT, is one of innovation and investment. In January of 2020, we shared our approach and strategies for leveraging Public Narrative's 30-year history to affect narrative change with Daniel Ash. In June of 2020, Daniel connected us to MBK Chicago, who was looking for a narrative change partner at the time. In February of 2023, we received our first grant award for narrative change from Nike and the Jordan brand. Nice. CCT was the first of our funders to invest in the ideation and execution of our narrative change strategies. Polk Brothers, of course, was soon to follow. In advancing equity and changing harmful public health, safety, and education narratives, all by engaging the storytellers. This morning, we'll hear from the leaders who've inspired this report, and our goal for this morning's discussion is to consider solutions that help to improve Black and Brown representation, particularly for boys and young men of color in the media, ultimately improving on the story of us. And now moderating the panel discussion is Jennifer Cole, co-author of the report and executive editor of the Chicago Sun-Times. Jennifer.
I'm supposed to put this thing on, so I'm gonna do this one. I was given instructions. Hi everyone, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for coming to this really important discussion. I'm just so thrilled. You know, as I was mentioning on our prep call, when I started working on this report with my co-author Victor Brand, I didn't yet live in Chicago or have any idea that I might one day soon live here and work here at the Sun-Times. I was a journalism research consultant, having served as managing editor for The Guardian US and HuffPost, then as senior director of strategic innovation at HuffPost. And I had the pleasure of doing a series of research projects exploring the nature of news communities and learning about what different communities and news consumers wanted in their news information. Having the opportunity to work with Jamira at Public Narrative and to listen to what you all said in the focus groups was right in my wheelhouse, and really a fascinating opportunity for me to hear what you thought about how boys and young men of color are portrayed in different media. And that information and perspectives I've heard have now informed my vision for the editorial strategy at the Sun-Times. So as I mentioned on the prep call, it was just amazing because I had listened over and over again to your voices. And then now I actually get to meet you in person or see you, on the online chat. So it's just so great to be here today with you today for this reunion. I know that so much has changed for many or all of you since you participated in June of 2021, with many people changing jobs. And, and the world has also changed. There's the pandemic, the economy, the war in the Ukraine, Twitter, and much, much more. And yet there's so much that remains the same or that still needs to change. So I'd like to start with each of you introducing yourselves. Please tell everyone your name, pronouns, title, and a brief line or two about why this topic of media portrayals of boys and young men of color is important or meaningful to you. And so I guess, would you like to start?
Yeah, I can start. My name is Yassine Abdul Sabor. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the education program manager and storyteller at Public Narrative. And the reason this work is so important to me is because just growing up as a young Black man, I've always understood how I need to present myself and understand how it impacts the way that we move through this world, through systemic oppression and all of that. So when I was able to come into this work and bring I have a background in graphic design, so bring my skill set to something that means so much to me, it just made all the sense in the world. And I've just been digging deeper into it and being able to uplift the voices of youth that look like me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Ash. My pronouns are he, him. I'm currently the president of the Field Foundation of Illinois. Before I answer the question, I actually want to acknowledge something. I want to let the audience know how great it is for me to be on a panel that's 100% men of color, and a significant number of Black men like me. In my professional career, I could probably count on one hand the number of times where I've had this experience. And I think that leads me to sort of the answer to the question of the prompt about what brings me to this work. The misrepresentation of Black people, and specifically the Black men, created significant harm, generational harm in our community. And the only way we stop that harm is to regain control of our narrative. Not just the narrative itself, but the platforms that deliver those narratives, we must also own them. As they say, if you want to change the story, change the narrator. That's always been a mantra for me, and I bring it sort of to this conversation.
How's it going? I'm Josh McGee. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an investigative reporter for Mindsight News, covering the intersection of criminal justice and mental health. And I think that this work is important because I've spent years on the desk, the crime and mayhem desk, talking about kind of how these narratives and stereotypes and tropes are seen, and I've seen how people respond to it. And I think it's been part of my fighting to continue to report, is to try to kind of expel these easy stereotypes that kind of be clung to Black men and boys.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Vondell Singleton. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the founder of CHAMP's Male Mentoring Program. CHAMP stands for Culturally Helping and Making Positive Success. We believe in 3 E's: education, empowerment, and exposure. The reason why this conversation is extremely important is because every day I get the distinct privilege of working with 400 young men across this city. And I get the opportunity to see the brilliance and excellence showcased through boys and young men of color that often the media do not portray. And so I have a moral responsibility in the position that I'm in to tell the stories of those who may be underrepresented.
No. I was gonna talk. All right. I got one? Okay. All right, thanks. All right. Morning, Evan Moore, pronouns he, him. As an author, DePaul University journalism adjunct professor. Some of you know me as another CBS press secretary. So, and also formerly of the Sun-Times, where I covered culture and entertainment.
Woo.
Also, I mean, outside of like the work and obvious reason I'm interested in it, because obviously I love it, I live it, it's what it is. And you just think about all the times when you walked in a room and people, like for instance at DePaul, my very first journalism class, I was sitting in the same seat that every professor in the journalism department sits in. White student walks in, he looks around, he's like, "Who's the professor?" I'm like, "Me." He's like, "Oh, okay." And he walks out. And I was like, it's already starting off. I was like literally the first day. Like, you're just like, all right, and you already, it's something you kind of roll your eyes a little bit because you already know like this kind of how things are, and it's kind of like throughout your career and covering different things and just being super aware of it, but also making sure that you're the person who wants to point on the story, because people will say what they want about you if you're not included. And that's why it's very important to also, stand up for yourself and make some people mad. That's okay. I'm stay mad. Like, so that's how, in terms of work, that's how I look at it.
I guess you don't need. Yeah. I got 2 mics. Hey, I'm Matt Harvey. I'm founder and CEO of We Home, creative services firm. We work with local businesses, and I also do media literacy education. At the time of the conversation we had for the report, I was a reporter at the Tribe. I had also worked at the Reader for a while, so that's a bit of my background in the work. But it matters to me because, I mean, look at me, you know what I'm saying? Like, look at us. We are the Black men that this report is talking about. And I also have an understanding of how media, by and large, shapes what we think in different forms, however you consume it. It's influencing how you make decisions. It's influencing what you think about the people around you and the world that you interact with. And I feel like as long as the media has this skew towards negativity, this skew towards just a straight up erasure of the Black male perspective, or just the Black perspective in general, there will always be this gap in coverage, this gap in our reality. And it'll always lead to these gaps in just how we live on a day-to-day basis. So that's why I feel like it's important.
What's up, guys? I'm Brandon Pope. Pronouns are he, him. I'm president of the National Association of Black Journalists Chicago chapter. I'm also over at WCIU and WBEZ. Why is this important to me? I mean, aside from the obvious that I am a Black man, I mean, this is why I got into what I do. This is why I'm a storyteller. It's also why I'm passionate about making sure that we have more Black people, especially Black men and young men of color, become journalists and become storytellers. Who better to shape our narratives than us? Yeah. And I think we see numerous examples, even recently with John Morant at the Memphis Grizzlies, and how that conversation went. I'm sure a lot of us got nauseated at how that conversation went, because we knew that there were not Black men leading the conversation, right? It was being led by somebody else. And because of that, you get harmful tropes, stereotypes, and narratives that run wild, that are unfair and just not right and dehumanizing. There's a way we can fix that. We have that power within ourselves, and so that's why I'm passionate about it. So I'm happy to be here, and looking forward to a great conversation.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Ballesteros. I'm a reporter at Injustice Watch. Before that, I was a reporter at the Sun-Times as well. Yeah, I just wanted to clap, that's why I said it. Pronouns are he, him. I think this conversation is important to me because, to Matt's point and everyone else's point, I think media does shape how we see the world, mediates how we understand different cultures, different places, different people than our own. And I think having grown up in the city, this very segregated city, I grew up with certain ideas about my own community, the Black community, the white community, and all of that was mediated through the news, stories, movies, and having to do the work to dispel some of the myths and tropes and ideas that I had developed, having consumed all these things, really opened my eyes to the influence that storytellers and journalists can have, but also to the strength of the forces that kind of make us believe these things. And so I think while obviously we don't have control over a whole news network or billions of dollars, unless, I don't know, maybe some of you do. I don't. But, you know, I want to do my part in bettering the conversation. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I also want to be sure I know we have some people joining us virtually, so I'm not sure how they can also introduce themselves.
Just call on each person and they'll introduce.
Okay. I can't remember everyone who's on. So I know. Okay. Yeah, Ade, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey. So I am Adeshina Emmanuel. I'm the managing editor at the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting. So I work for Louisville Public Media. I've been in Chicago media though most of my career. I was mostly the editor-in-chief at Injustice Watch, and I am a Chicago Sun-Times alum, DNA Info alum. I've covered education. Yeah, I know I was going to get that. A lot of Sun-Times love here. Nothing wrong with that. And I've covered education in the city at Chalkbeat, and also I've worked at the Chicago Reporter. So, my whole career has been in Chicago, except for more recently. And I'm from Uptown, which I have to give Uptown a shout out anytime. That's my real hometown. I think these issues are important to me for a lot of the reasons a lot of folks have said, but especially because these issues are actionable. There's a lot we can do to understand and address the problems that we're going to discuss today. And I think that goes for both our professional and personal lives. And I find a lot of purpose in that. So that's what I say.
Thank you. Thank you. We also have online Judy. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning, everybody. My name is Judy Touzet. My pronouns are she and her. Currently, I'm the Innovation and Partnerships Catalyst for a nonprofit organization called Metromorphosis in Baton Rouge. I'm also working with the city to help them relaunch their My Brother's Keeper chapter. In terms of why this work is important to me, I enter the conversation as the sister of 3 brothers, the aunt of 4 nephews, and the former teacher and principal for hundreds of beautiful brown and Black boys in New York City. And I think having them say to me at 8 years old that when they think of Black, the first words that come to mind are dirty or stupid or poor or ugly was kind of my first real introduction to how pervasive and pernicious the narrative can be, especially on our youngest minds. And so I've been invested for the past 2 decades in helping to work alongside others who are invested in changing the narrative so that both our men of today, but our boys that are coming up can be in a world that actually affirms them for their beauty, their humanity, and their worth.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you could be here with us. I think the last panelist we have online is Victor Brand, my co-author. Vic, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Vic Brand. As Jen mentioned, I helped her write the report. I'm an editor and writer in Brooklyn, I'm interested in this work because I think that this is important for all journalists and to have a sense of this. And in a previous life, I worked at HuffPost around issues of accuracy, and I believe that the journalists can create narratives that are just as inaccurate through omission and oversight and laziness and cliches, and this kind of work that's important to do to counteract a lot of the practices that kind of get caked on and gunked on over time, and need to kind of get chipped off.
Thank you, Vic. All right, so just as a reminder, because we have so many amazing panelists here today, we're not going to all be able to answer every question, but I would like to hear from all of you at least on a few questions. So definitely, speak up when you have something to say. Also online, if you, I guess, put something in the chat or raise your hand, then we'll call on you. And then also, just for my sake and for other people who are in different parts of media here, if you are talking about media, if you could be as specific as possible to say what you're talking about, like you're talking about news, talking about broadcast, or you're talking about film, TV shows, streaming, whatever it is, that'll, I think, help us out. All right, so we kind of touched on this just now in your first answers, but I'd love to know if there's anything else you'd like to say, any of you, about how these portrayals, like the prevailing narratives and perceptions in media, affect Black and brown boys and young men, and also other people connected to those boys and young men. Just wondering about how these portrayals, the prevailing narratives and perceptions in media that we were talking about, affect Black and brown boys and young men, and also the people connected to those boys and young men. So beyond yourself, though you can definitely include stuff about yourself.
If I could, I want to start off, and I'm going to reference the report a little bit just because I was dealing with the report a lot. I designed the report. I want to pat myself on the back. But one thing that Carlos said that was referenced in the report was there isn't enough diverse views about Black and brown people in media when it comes to news, when it comes to portrayals in movies. Every form of media that you think of is a very narrow type of way of life that Black and brown people are living. And how that impacts Black and brown young boys is they don't see what they can be. All they see is the whatever tropes you want to say. I'm not going to list them off because there's so many things that you can do and be. And I think that's one of the main reasons that these conversations are helpful, and for us to portray ourselves to everyone in the public as who we are, purely because it shows Black and brown young men that they can be so many things and be themselves completely.
Thank you. And just because I don't know that everyone has read the report, at least not as many times as we have, I would say that one of the things that Carlos said was really about Black and brown boys being flattened kind of in their portrayals in media, being portrayed either as good or evil, angels or devils, the criminal or the basketball star, leaving out a lot of the kind of humanity and gray area. And I think that resonated a lot with other people on the panel and with me, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one way that you see that really come full circle is in the TV news world where I'm operating. It's something as simple as the photos we choose when we're talking about victims of gun violence or victims of crime. I've worked in tons of newsrooms, where I'm not the decision maker behind those things. And I find out secondhand and I'm just like, whoa. Why is a white victim of gun violence, we find a photo from him on Facebook of him smiling with his pets and his family, but a black victim of gun violence, it's a mugshot or a picture that's just not as flattering or doesn't portray them in a positive light. Why do we do that? I do think we have gotten better nationally with that because people have called it out. That's what we have to do. We have to call it out when we see it, but there's still a lot of work to be done. That's one of the most common ways that we see these stereotypes get re-portrayed is that just as simple as the photos we're selecting when we're talking about victims of gun violence or any other crime. We have to be intentional and caring about, this is someone that died. They have family, they have friends, they have loved ones. They left a legacy beyond what you can really encapsulate in a photo. So you want to make sure that the photo you select is empathetic and doesn't strip them of their humanity. And I just see that so often. We don't think about the humanity. And some of those things happen unconsciously. And so I think it's important that we call that out when we see things like that, right? Because we got to protect ourselves. We got to protect our kids, protect our young men of color from those negative stereotypes. That's where I see it the most happen, is in the TV news side, but it happens everywhere too.
Thank you.
The humanity thing is a big point to me because I feel like, I'm sorry, the humanity thing is a big point to me because there's the part of it where it's like, you know, what we see in media, but then there's a part of it where it really becomes about our survival on a day-to-day basis. It becomes about, like, you know, these media narratives aren't just we don't just see them on TV and that's it. Or we just see them, you know, we just read them in the newspaper and that's the end of it. It ultimately, like I said in my intro, it affects how we view the world, how we see the world. So when the people who are making decisions, whether that be a police officer or a principal or a mayor or a school superintendent, are getting narratives from the media that aren't full and all-encompassing and truly humanizing, it makes them prone to do things or make decisions that they wouldn't necessarily make for someone who they view as fully human. They don't consider the natural flaws that people, because I personally don't like to harp on like the fact that, you know, that I know people that commit crimes, honestly. And I feel like most of us do. And the reality is that there's a humanity to that. I know y'all know people that commit crimes that make millions of dollars. And so, as long as, no, for real, and as long as those people who commit those crimes aren't viewed as like being some like actually, you don't think of them as criminals, being, you know, you still see them as human. Even when they're presented in media committing a crime, you see them as human. And that it ultimately affects how expendable we are to society. So that's how I see it.
I'll add on here. I don't want to talk too much. I don't want to take over too much real estate. But I'm thinking about this more broadly too, just storytelling overall. I cover a lot of film and TV. And in that space, we got to think about what stories are we supporting? Let's get honest here, right? There's stories that we as men of color create and support. And there's other stories that need to be uplifted, that give us more, you know, diverse perspectives of who we are, that we just aren't doing across the board, whether it's streaming, whether it's movies, TV, who we promote, what articles promote, the outlets we choose to promote. We got to support our own at some point, right? And we have to make sure that we're prioritizing the storytelling that is giving us a full, colorful picture. You know, there's a lot of popular, I call them drug shows, BMF, Power, stuff like that. No shade to those that create those, right? But like, there's other TV shows out there that tell really powerful Black and Latino stories that get canceled after a season because no one's watching. And we complain. Why is no one telling these stories? Because you're not supporting them, you're not watching them. So I think it's important for all of us too to make sure that when we see great storytelling, positive storytelling from other people, that we're backing it, that we're watching it, that we're sharing it from outlets all across the board. I think that's really crucial. I really do.
And to piggyback on what Brandon was saying, I mean, I was in that culture and entertainment. I was in that culture and entertainment space. Thank you. I was in that culture and entertainment space, and I looked at when I reached out to the subject for a story. I knew there was a heavy responsibility because this is you think about it when someone sees themselves in the newspaper online in a positive way, they're gonna go to the store and get the newspaper. They're gonna share with their friends online and everything else. And low key, it's a historical document. It's like how we have obituaries, and every time you go to a funeral or something like that, everybody grab the obituary because there's a historical document of someone's family and everything else. And yeah, because when I was on that beat, I always made myself available, because I wasn't one of those people that think, oh, he work at this sometimes, maybe he's not going to read my email. I read everything. I was to read every email. And my DMs were open, or it was Instagram or Twitter, like you just never know like that. So I just wanted to be available to someone to reach out. Because speaking of that, you're probably familiar with that show called Johnson that's on Bounce TV.
Yep.
Yeah, and there are people reached out to me, and they sent me like 3 episodes, and I'm looking at the show. I'm like, there's a divorced dad who likes hockey. That's like me. And there's like, and I saw these different things, and I'm just like, I saw myself being seen. I knew that story was important, so I'm the one telling that story. And when you meet people in these spaces, there's also because they've been screwed by media in the past, so they kind of look at it like, I don't know what this is with this guy, whatever. And you get to talk to them, you tell them like, look, I'm just trying to tell the best story possible. You do something good, that's great. You do something stupid, I'm gonna have to write about that too. Just be honest with you. But also, you look at it like, hey, this is someone of my community, and who's the best person to tell that story. And knowing some of the people up here, for me, I make myself available. Some people say, I already see you in South Shore walking around like this. I'm out here. It's really what it is. And I just let people see you, because many of my colleagues in media, they don't live around the people they write about. Let's be honest, like I see people at the barbershop, the grocery store, when I'm walking my daughter around the neighborhood, or just out and about. So people, they see you, they can touch you, but I know it's not like that for other places, but that's really is the start, because people are looking for things. They're looking for, a pretty good TV show or a podcast or anything like that. So I'm always pumping up someone's work, and also being available for mentorship or anything like that, because, you just know how things are. And sometimes you're just like, well, if I don't get out front of that, then who is? So that's how I look at things in that sense.
Thank you so much. And Judy, I know you raised your hand online. Do you want to weigh in?
Thank you. I'll be brief. I think I wanted to add into the conversation about the humanizing, or the sense of lack of humanity being affirmed, even when we're talking about Black victims. And I think part of that is just deeply connected to the fact that in the American psyche, that Black folks, Black men in particular, have been dehumanized. And so in order to get to the place where they are being humanized in the media, there would have to be a rehumanization in the mind. And I think that that's part of our work. And what will it take for us to be able to help shift the mental models around Black men and boys? Because I think a lot of the outcomes that they're constantly overrepresented in incarceration, school experiences, those behaviors are manifestations of our mindsets. And so I think that that's part of the work, and what makes it so hard is that it lives there. And until the mindset can be shifted, then how do we make sure that there are at least more people working in these spaces who do have the appropriate mindset, who do see them as humans and people worthy of being talked about, or their stories shared in their fullness and in their complexity.
Thank you so much. You have so many great things to say. I can't believe we're like halfway through this time. And I've only got off one question. I would like to get a few more. You can see how many I have planned. So,
My bad.
no, it's great. I feel like this could go on all day. So let's talk about trust in media. Overall, do you think trust is growing or shrinking when you kind of think about local news in Chicago, especially, and why?
I like to, can I use your? So maybe about a year ago, it was a producer from CNN who reached out to my organization here in Chicago. And he was so excited. He was like, hey, I want to come to Chicago and I want to tell a story about your organization. But the topic is carjacking.
Yeah.
What? Whoa.
So I said, I said, let me hear a little bit more before I shut this down. So you mean to tell me you want to come from Atlanta to Chicago to tell a story about our organization through the lens of carjacking? Oh, no, I didn't mean it that way. And here, so we got down to, I forgot the brother's name. Y'all will probably know who he is. He's a well-respected black man. He does a lot of phenomenal work for CNN. He kind of cleaned it up.
Victor Blackwell?
Victor Blackwell.
Was it Victor?
I can't remember, but he's well known. But he cleaned it up for me. He cleaned it up. And he said, no, we don't want to tell a story about your organization through the lens of carjacking. We want to hear the stories behind why it would be tempting for young men who are not engaged to want to carjack. But then we also want to tell the intervention of what you're doing to offset through prevention and intervention. I said, okay, that's better. But here's the problem. Once I presented it to my young man, they was like, man, I don't want to be on camera. So you talk about trust. It was already a mistrust because it was still the topic of carjacking. Right. And I'm gonna be honest with you. I had young men that was really out there doing it, that I was working with to help them find a better way so they don't have to do it. So we had a pre-conversation before the conversation. And, you know, it was, so if you go back and you watch the video, everybody's face is blurred out. All my young man's face blurred out. And there was one particular young man who had agreed to go on to talk and tell his story, but he didn't show up that day. So I'm calling his mom, hey, where my man at? Yeah, he's supposed to be there. He told me he was on his way. Well, he didn't show up. So I talked to him afterwards. He was like, Singleton, I just couldn't do it because it's a danger in having my face out there. My ops gonna see me. They're gonna know why I'm at. There was a whole nother story behind that story. And for me, I kind of felt like I let him down because it still wasn't the story that should have been ran in the media once I saw it. It was a little bit of information about, yeah, this is a CHAMPS program. They're doing phenomenal work through education, empowerment, and exposure. But look at all these carjackings taking place with Black and brown boys, right? And for me, that was a letdown. And then there was a kid who was in that story. And you probably heard about the kid who was shot and killed at the Bean. He was actually in that story. He was part of my organization. And I had to fight and stand in front of the media to humanize him, as to Brandon's point, to say, yeah, he had goals and dreams just like anybody else. And he took his younger cousin, who's still alive to this day, and I'm working with because he experienced and witnessed the senseless death of his cousin being shot and killed because somebody bumped into him, pulled out a gun, and just shot him dead in broad daylight, right? And so for me, it was, again, these images, and I couldn't sleep for weeks. And working with his mom and working with his family, I couldn't sleep because I'm just like, something has to be done. It's hard for me to get a good story out. They tell me to write the format, do it a certain way, send it to these people. And I'm like, man, I ain't biting on that. We want to take the kids out to the Super Bowl. We took kids to Dubai. We took kids to London. We've been to China. Ain't nobody doing major reports on this. Why? I followed the format. So again, if it's a carjacking situation, if somebody gets shot, it's 1,000 media on the street. They want to interview everybody. What happened? Was he part of a gang? Was he from the O Block? Like, come on, y'all. Let's humanize the experiences of boys and young men of color. I'm a product of mentorship. I know it works. I'm from Chicago. My grandfather, and I talked about it in the article, my grandfather came here in 1921. He left Mississippi. Back then, they would do a census, knock on the door, and ask who can read and write. No one in my family could read or write. He came to Chicago to make a better lifestyle. 1923, he married my grandmother, had 9 children. My father's the baby. All my family grew up in Otterby Wells housing projects. I was part of that 3rd generation, right? But I'm the first one to graduate from college in 2002. My grandfather came in 1921. So look how many generations it took just for me to get through. We got a lot of work to do, y'all. I'm gonna just go ahead and pause for a quick second, let somebody else jump in, because I got a lot I can say.
Well, I want to start to move into kind of some of the things that can be done, right? We talked about that as well, how to expand and change, start to expand and change narratives. In this report, we talked about the need for more and different kinds of stories, success stories, not just basketball stars or sports stars and entertainers, solution stories, more information about resources that could help the community, history and context, and all of these things kind of as a way to kind of combat this like kind of flattening of the portrayals, as well as the need for more media literacy. So I'd like to start with a question for Daniel, because I know you come at this from a little bit of a different perspective, than someone in media. And I'm wondering, like, how does your understanding of the report kind of correspond to Field's mission and strategic goals of funding spaces that explore and advocate for changing harmful narratives? And are there solutions that tie into this report that Field is interested in or already exploring?
Well, let me. I'm going to get to your question. I promise.
Okay.
So as someone who is in a position of privilege, meaning I get to decide how to direct funding, I've come to the conclusion that it's important, absolutely critical, that we fund the infrastructure that will deliver accurate stories about our community. So I want to bridge for a moment to Vondel's point, and I really appreciate you sharing the story of your family. So his grandfather, coming from Mississippi to Chicago, there's a lot of data and evidence that he probably had heard about Chicago many, many times by reading the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender and many other platforms like it nationwide represent an infrastructure that was created by our community to sort of own and direct our story. And this is specific to, journalism, but it had ripple effect across all other sectors. That infrastructure has eroded. And we can have another forum about the impact of journalism and technology, and that's another discussion. But even before technology, that infrastructure was eroding. And so as a member of philanthropy, I have made a commitment to using my platform to encourage reinvestment in that type of infrastructure, which today, when I think about the Drive, when I think about Hermine Indigo Studios, and India, that platform, and there are many others, both here locally and nationwide, philanthropy needs to invest. But we shouldn't just invest in projects. We have to invest in core infrastructure so that those institutions can hire folks like Evan and Brandon and their peers, all of you guys who work as journalists. I would also add one other point. In philanthropy, there's this ongoing debate about the role of philanthropy in local journalism. It's my position that the role of philanthropy in local journalism will always be necessary from this point onward. I use this framing to make the point. And then actually, for the audience, let me give you some context. There's a lot of money being poured into local journalism, the local journalism ecosystems in this city and others. And many folks who are authorizing those investments believe that the investments are necessary to bridge from this current reality to reality where we're going to discover a business model that will sustain local journalism. I believe the new business model will always require journalism. And I think that's particularly important for platforms that are grounded in communities of color. And again, the framework that I use to sort of help illustrate the point is that it's the university model. Philanthropy is always funding universities, research projects. You have endowed professorships, chairs, et cetera. And so there's always this belief, there's this prevailing belief that the university system in this country as it exists will always lean on philanthropy over time. I believe that model is going to be somehow replicated for local journalism. Now, bridging back to this point about this issue, I think it's particularly important for us to accelerate investment in platforms that are covering our community. When I say our community, I'm talking specifically about Black and Brown communities. Because we need to have platforms that are viable, that have the capacity and the interest in developing trust with the community. Again, I think there are platforms that have existed historically. I speak to the Crusader, I think about Southside Weekly, I think about Indigo Studios, I think about WVON. There are many others. And now you have new arrivals like Tribe and others that are leaving that footprint. Again, the critical sort of point for me is creating the conditions for substantial investments to be made into those businesses so that they're viable. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
I'm taking too much.
No.
You did call on me.
Yeah, I did. I just want to, Ade had raised his hand a while ago, so I want to just get him and you next, all right? Ade, go ahead.
Hey, yeah. So in terms of like what we can do, I've really been thinking about just like, okay, it's this idea of like how we try to understand the people we're supposed to be serving, Black boys, brown boys, young men of color, and how we use that understanding to inform and produce our work, not making assumptions about what people need, but truly listening and not just sticking that away in some report full of insights, but saying, how are we using this understanding to produce the journalism that we do? And I think that doesn't happen as much in a way that's embedded throughout organizations. And I think we talk about what reporters and editors can do in terms of shaping coverage. I also think about just newsrooms really having it be a forever goal, if you will, to like address some of these issues, whether it's stereotypes and depictions of folks we're talking about, or any other harm that the media does. And I think that where there aren't really those values operationalized at an org, whether it's in their strategic planning, whether it's in a pitch form when you're taking a story from a reporter and they're describing how they're going to go about reporting a story and their framing. I think that there has to be that level of intentionality. And I think that I think that the Black press certainly is a place where that's happened historically, because they truly look at our community as, and not just the Black press, I think any ethnic, press that sort of focuses on a community that they know and have understanding and empathy with, that I think a lot of it starts there. And some of those entities that are already been doing that work, that investing more in that, because they're centering that audience and seeing the wholeness and complexity of that audience, and they're oriented that way. But a lot of those places don't have as many resources or capacity as they could. And I think where we talk about the philanthropy, the foundations, and anybody who has a dollar they want to give toward journalism, they want to see produced that they think is good for a community, I think that it's good to kind of look toward the folks who are doing that work and the people who aren't doing that work, to try to figure out how can we really restructure and rebuild how we create journalism to better reflect, I think, the need in the community. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Matt?
So the community aspect of it is really important to me. It's one of the things that kind of inspired my work at We Home. But the goal of educating people about media, it has to be central to everything that we do in terms of building trust with people, in terms of like building these increasing funding or increasing funding for like businesses, for example, like the Tribe or like Block Club or whoever's doing this work. It goes nowhere if we're not educating the people that we're trying to talk to. So one of the things that I find really important, and I mentioned at the top of being a media literacy educator, is talking to people in school, talking to kids in schools, like having programs for students in school. Because it's kind of crazy that you could graduate from high school and not know anything about how the difference between a commentator or a reporter. You don't know how a story comes together. You don't know why it doesn't make sense necessarily for a reporter to filter their stories through you, the subject. And the reality is that what happens is that people grow up and they have this same distrust that Vondell kind of described. It's like when I was at the Tribe, I did a lot of man on the street work. I mean, I would stop off in Grand Crossing or Garfield Park or wherever else, and I would just walk up to people and I would try and talk to them. And you know, it's alarming for one, them hearing that a reporter come in and talk to them. For one, they don't necessarily trust that that's what I do. They're much more likely to see a Black boy at my age as a cop than they do a reporter of the news. So like, there's always this barrier of like having to convince people that like that their word is safe for me, that I'm trustworthy, that you know you're a part of this process. And that was something that's really important to me. That anybody I interviewed, we were texting throughout this process so they know I just sent this work in for edits, and they got questions about what edits are, what's happening there. It's just editing my words, not editing your words exactly how you said them. You know, just little education, like as much as we can, because there will always be like this, that you can try your darndest to try and get community together, but you can't build community around something that they don't believe in or trust. So, and you can't trust something that you don't understand. So it really has to be about teaching people. I believe firmly that it starts in high school programs, and I mean, even as early as elementary school, honestly. Media literacy is so fundamental that in the same way that we have academies like Ariel Academy that's founded with the energy around financial literacy, that same energy has to be around media literacy.
I was just really struck by that point that you made and Evan made about kind of the lack of just the state of general awareness about how we do our work, which was really, I thought, important to remember. And I thought the point too was that it's not just about, you know, a media literacy so people understand how to consume the news critically, but also so people can help produce the news and tell the stories. And also, even if you just want to pitch, you know, if we want to get more of these stories and narratives in the media, we need better pitches, and people don't understand like how to even pitch or who to pitch or what we're looking for. And so I thought all of those points were super important and relevant. Looked like you were about to say something.
Before you go, because I don't want to lose this point, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that it is state policy that media literacy is supposed to be taught in our high schools. It is, and I can make sure we share that so people understand that there's state policies. But like so many policies, it was an unfunded sort of mandate. And I've asked the question a number of times in my previous role here at the Trust. It's like, well, what are school districts doing? And I haven't been able to sort of nail that. But I wanted to let folks know that this is an important point, and the policy step has already been taken. What we now need to do is sort of drive toward sort of adopting and implementing the policy.
No, you're good. That's perfect. I wanted to piggyback off of Matt's point, and Matt knows this as well, that this report actually inspired what Public Narrative is doing with a partnership with Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism and creating.
Medill in the house.
And we actually, it's just so crazy to see this in full circle. I'm so excited about it because it shows that these conversations bring solutions. And it's a very small step. We have a course of 59 students at Butler College Prep in the Intro to Journalism course, where we're actually partnering to bring them these different media literacy tools. So understanding, like teaching them different ways to understand what narrative change is, why it's important, how you can tell your story in a better way. And right now they're working on podcasts. We were just there a couple weeks ago, and they're just like, I want to talk about basketball. Well, what narrative are you addressing about how basketball is viewed in Black and brown communities? They're like, I want to talk about anime. Like, what narrative are you addressing, and what is your new perspective that's coming from you as a young man? And how can this change the way people perceive people who are interested in this? So these different tools need to be continued to be funded. And conversations like this help bring solutions and more connection to different networks so we can create those solutions.
Thank you. You know, we are 5 minutes over. Oh, sorry, everyone, were you about to say something?
Yeah, so real quick.
Oh, I've gotten some mic problems. I'm so sorry. Okay.
For instance, like the class I teach at DePaul is called Chicago Undercover, where we get into these issues about how marginalized communities are covered. And the first class, we honestly taught the students, and we got to get to know, like, because some of them are from here and they're from communities, different communities, and we hand them a sheet of the city broken down in neighborhoods. We say, circle the neighborhoods you've been to, and it won't shock you that most of them are North Side neighborhoods. South, maybe they've been in maybe Pilsen, maybe, or South Loop, and that's kind of like the problem there. And also, we got as journalism and media spaces, we kind of have to get away from acting like it's a big secret, because sometimes people don't know what we're doing, and something simple as when you explain to someone what background means, what off the record means, and why, when you talk to folks from government agencies or other places, every other word is off the record, and I think that's something that a lot of folks just don't know. And this is something that even journalists, it's times where you even have to explain to someone. If I told a journalism student doing really well, I say, go cover a presser at City Hall or at a police headquarters, and they don't drive, I'm like, well, how you gonna get there? Are you gonna take the red line? Are you gonna take the green line? Where you need to go? And that's something we kind of noticed with our students there, that they just didn't know like basic civics. And we and it's something we had to address. And there's adults too in this, and trained adults and journalists too, at these agencies too. So it's something I think that plays out in our elections. Right.
Oh, thank you. We're over time, but I do want to ask just one last question, and I did want to add, and because I want to just make sure that we have room for everybody else's questions as well. And like I said, I could take up the whole time just asking you questions, but I won't. But I did want to underline one point that Brandon made earlier that I think is really relevant to this point here about what do we need to do to expand and change narratives. And one of the frustrations that we have in the news is that even though many of us really want to cover, like people working to create change and impact, we really want to cover different stories and things like that. And audiences say they want it. Oftentimes, that's not what cuts through. There was just this new study that came out, Nature Human Behavior Journal study that was written up in the Atlantic this last week about, how bad news just gets more clicks and gets more shares and things like that. And I think we know, even though we know from like Solution Journalism Network research and stuff that once people do click, they're more likely to engage with the story with some of the stuff in it, that people really want. It's hard to get them to see it in the first place. And like this thing, I don't think media's ever been great at like kind of determining, like, forcing anybody to read or watch or view or listen, So what can we do there as part of one of the things I'm going to ask about. But just because we're running out short time, feel free to jump in on that. But I would like to kind of hear from everyone, if possible, a little bit of a flash round. You can react to that or talk about something else. But really, I want reflectiveness, sort of, when you think about this conversation about the portrayal of Black and brown boys and young men in the media, what has stayed with you? Have you seen any changes? Has any of your perspectives changed? I would just love to hear a little bit of reflection, because this has been like a year and it's been like a couple of years since you did the focus groups and stuff. So I'd love to hear from everyone. And then I will turn it over to everyone else.
I think on the is this working? No.
Press button.
Hello. Okay. I think on the reflection point, I think I'm gonna use an example that really got me thinking on this recently. When the city of Chicago used to close school in Woodlawn to house immigrants or refugees, the protests that happened outside that school got so much media attention, but what didn't get as much media attention was residents from that same neighborhood coming to a church to say, "We welcome you here. There's food here, etc." So I think that, so to your point of the negative news getting more attention, I think ultimately, I think journalists are at fault for some of that. We give it more attention, therefore we put it on the air. But I do think the business model is pretty broken, and I think waiting for, say, I don't know, WGN or whatever, to change ways and make less of a profit is not very ideal. And I think things will remain the same more than they will change, unfortunately. But I do think we are trying to figure out ways of changing the industry. I think philanthropy and nonprofits are making headways. That's also kind of fragile, because at some point maybe rich people will stop giving money to journalism, and then what? And so I am very scared for the future, quite frankly. But I do think the least we can do is highlight ways in which this narrative is broken. And I'm thinking exactly of that example from Woodlawn. Like, I really wish there would have been more attention to the "Hey, we welcome you here" as there was for the "Get out of here" protests. But the other thing too, I think, is you know what? I'll do that.
Thank you, Carlos.
I'll add to it. I just might, well, on the point of the business model is an important thing to bring up, because I think that there is kind of this idea, and I've faced this in multiple newsrooms, where we still kind of cling to this urgency business model in journalism, this trying to be first. And the reality is that there is no more being first for a true reporter. To do good at your job, and this is something that I encountered and often had to pretty much convince editors of, that there's no value in me getting this out before anybody else, because they've heard about it on Twitter already. They heard about it on Facebook. One of their homies posted on their Instagram story. Everybody know about this already. So my story isn't going to introduce this concept to somebody. And I think as long as we try and we think our value as journalists is being like the first person to introduce information, when really it's just to teach people something. And so if they can read my story and learn something new about this concept, if they can read my story and learn something new about what happened, so that, I'm writing stories about, say, I'm covering the same press conference that somebody from WGN is covering, say, and I was working at the tribe. WGN has a staff of tens, hundreds of reporters to add to say whatever it is they need to say about everything happening in the city. I'm one staff writer writing for the tribe. So the idea that I'm going to get this story out before this guy sitting next to me, how? They get to their entire job. They woke up this morning knowing this is what they was doing, and this is all they was focused on. And so, like, as long as we kind of have this business model of trying to be the first, we won't get anywhere. We have to understand that our value is educating people, adding something new to the conversation, and that means doing research. That means finding people to interview who you might not have spoken to before. That means going outside and talking to the people that's just outside about how it affects them. This is how I think that's where our value is as reporters. That's where our value is in media. And as long as we aren't, I guess, accepting that or understanding that, it'll be kind of, we're just going to be hitting our head against the wall. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Anyone else want to have a last word? Go ahead, Wendell.
So I'm not media trained at all. I'm speaking from the community perspective. What I would like to see is simply what Public Narrative did. You came out, I think it was a Saturday, right, Yassine? Yeah. And spoke to our young men. And a lot of them need to have the media literacy, because we don't know what we don't know. So come to the table and meet us where we are. We're not as polished as you all, but I guarantee we have the potential to tell our own stories if you give us the pen to write it.
We have two more quick last things from Ade and Vic.
Great. Ade, would you like to go?
Yeah. I think it's always important, of course, to have more diversity, of course, more Black and brown reporters, editors, and decision makers, leaders of organizations, and again, just those investments in the Black and brown press and leaders who are trying to tell these stories with, I think, with more humane and whole light of, the humanity of boys and young men. I think that that's, like, to me, really, really important that we, as an industry, prioritize that and get resources in those spaces and make sure that we're creating accessibility to, the means of storytelling, and also giving communities more abilities, and well, not more ability, more resources to tell their own stories. And I think all that will go a long way.
Thank you. Vic?
I think that the point that the problems about being fast, that there's a lot of kind of the way that the media works. There's these business incentives that have led to the kinds of coverage that we have, and I guess two thoughts that I have is that it's that most media institutions are fairly big ships, and getting them to turn and change is like a slow process. Also, that the way media works, that journalists are really bad at retrospection. They're always moving on to the next story, and there's not a lot of thought given to, like, how did we do that coverage, or what is our coverage? To take an example from the Times and their trans coverage, like, what does our coverage look like in the aggregate? And so I think that two things that media institutions need to think about in terms of how do they change their culture and try to improve what they're doing, and it's you need to figure out ways to look back at your coverage and question how your processes are feeding into the creation of the problems, and you've got to revisit them on a regular basis and check where you are. And then the other thing I think is that I think that media groups can be a part of that media literacy. And when we were at HuffPost, I always encouraged journalists who, if they were speaking to a source who didn't have a lot of interaction with the media, that they do some of that media education and tell them, it's like, this is what on the record means, this is what off the record means. And you have to do kind of a mini boot camp right there in the moment with your sources, so that they understand what your own process as a journalist is, so that then they aren't taken by surprise, and you don't want them to feel hard done by because they didn't understand what your process was.
Thank you, Vic. I believe there was someone here who wanted the last word.
Yeah, no, I think we're talking about a lot of the right things. One of the things is I think we always have the diversity coming into the door. There's a young journalist who's Black or brown, but when we're talking about people who, in the long term, kind of build up that trust. The reporters here that are Black and brown are the survivors. They don't last that long on the crime beat. You're doing that for 2-3 years. You don't get the chance to advance. You don't get that chance to dig deeper and to think deeper into your stories. And it's traumatic. It's traumatic doing these stories that do have a racial, they have a tone to them. So one of the things is giving people this position, Black and brown people, to stay in a newsroom, to be there for a couple of years so that they can report on Chicago and they can build that trust with communities. And I think that's usually what's missing. You don't have a reporter that's been here for 5 years that you can go back to, or someone can remember, oh, you wrote the story about my neighbor. You did a good job. I'm glad that you humanized them. I'm glad that you told the story this way. All of a sudden you get the Black and brown reporters that have been doing this for a while. They have to jump to a national ship. They have to jump somewhere bigger so that they can have enough money to survive, and so that they can get the help to grow and to go to advance themselves in this kind of career.
Great point. Thank
Yeah.
you. Sure.
All right.
But I do just want to give people an opportunity to ask a question after you.
Yeah, this is an important point. I want the introspection that Vic was mentioning.
You're not on. Yeah, there's probably.
That works.
The introspection and, or as Vic framed it, the retrospection that should be done is not going to be volunteer, right? So as a community, we have to demand more from the local ecosystem. And I say that because we can't just pick one organization and target them and demand change. So for example, it's not enough to just force the Sun-Times to behave differently or force the Tribune to behave differently. I think the community, as we become more literate when it comes to media, has to advocate for change with the entire system. And we're at a moment where that's possible because the disruption in media, particularly local journalism, is such that these institutions depend on one another in ways that they didn't depend on one another in the past, right? So the Sun-Times and BEZ, they need Injustice Watch. They need HuffPo. They need Block Club. They need Chalkbeat and other institutions to be sort of funneling content sort of to them and perspective. So that we have to demand that the system be in service to our local community in the same way that we demand government do the same. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for that point. Now, I keep promising that I'm going to let other people ask questions. So let's do it. Does anyone have a question? You got to press the button. Oh, yeah, there you go.
Oh, okay. We have one question here.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any attorneys in the room. I know the young man from Justice Watch, but I'm just wondering, have you all discussed or thought about any legal approaches to the wrongful and perpetuated narratives and images and stereotypes? Has that been part of your conversation?
That's a good question. It is a good question. Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm sorry. Okay. So honestly, it's kind of hard to, I look at it, so like I've thought about that actually. Like I've been like, man, like how, I feel like at a certain point, this malpractice kind of amounts to nearly like it should be illegal. Like this should be against the law for you to like blatantly lie about something. But the reality is that in a sense, for one, there are a lot of publications that can get away with the idea that media is allowed to be fictional. And so it's not like they could say something, even if it's in Fox News or wherever else, and they can call themselves news for real. But even like that's, and taking that example actually specifically, Fox argued in court that their media isn't actually news. You know what I'm saying? So like there are people that are allowed to kind of masquerade as journalists or reporters or having, being some kind of news media. But the reality is that the laws are such that, it's just as frustrating as like the thing I mentioned in the beginning, how there's so many millionaires who commit crimes every day, but those crimes, aren't policed as heavily as the crimes that like somebody who live around the corner from these police. And so it's a similar kind of like, at that point, it gets into the infrastructure of our criminal justice system. And that needs to be overhauled, for whatever reasons, outside of this. But like that's why it's kind of like, it's kind of hard to straight up say like, this got to be against the law. This type of reporting got to be against the law because they skate around it. They say like, I'm not actually a reporter, or this isn't technically news, or this isn't technically that. So the legal stuff gets mucky. No law is going to be in a bad journalist.
Any other questions?
One of you.
Okay.
I'm the person who has a comment instead of a question, but Jamira gave me permission. So I'm Deborah Douglas. I'm the director of the Midwest Solutions Journalism Hub at Medill at Northwestern. I've been back about a month-ish because I've been on the road, going back in, but I was really heartened to hear all of you talk today, because everything that you talked about is everything that the hub that I'm building is about. Brandon, I really zeroed in on your earlier comments. What you're talking about is asset framing versus deficit framing. And what the hub is here to do is to invite media outlets like the Sun-Times, where I spent nearly a decade of my career, is to invite them into community, into training, to learn how to better tell stories of marginalized communities from an asset frame and not a deficit frame. I always tell people, when you hear Southside, what do you hear? If you look at the way the story is told about us all around the world, you may think crime, but that's just a direction. The Southside is a direction made up of communities, made up of neighborhoods, made up of blocks, made up of households with families and individuals who get up every day to be better than they were the day before. And if we can flip the script on that, and I've been doing it in earnest for a decade, because I had to check myself after being at the Sun-Times for about 2 years, it really changes the way that you tell stories. It makes people feel better, it makes them more engaged, it makes us closer, more true to what we say we are on paper, to paraphrase a famous man.
Thank you, Deb.
My name is Hermine Hartman, and I am the publisher of Indigo. One of the things that we're not talking about, which is the elephant in the room, is racism. It's alive and well, y'all, okay? And what our job is as Black media, is call it out, all right? I'll give you an example, because I'm getting ready to get on a crusade, and I want y'all to join me. When you look at the news, and somebody got killed, Black kid got killed, South Side, West Side. They have an age. They don't always have a name. 13-year-old got killed, car wreck, shooting, blah, blah. And they give an age, 54 years old, 10 years old, Walmart shooting, 15 years old. Now, think about this. It wasn't until 1850 in the census that we had names. We had descriptions. You were a domestic, you were a carpenter, you were this or that, but you didn't have a name. My point is, in your discussion on humanity, we're still trying to be human. We're still trying to work on being human beings. If you watch the news, and I'm a news person, they cover animals better than they cover Black boys. The animals are cute, the animals are darling, the animals need adoption. They spend more time. There used to be a time, and this is something we need to go back to, and this is some SEC stuff. There used to be a time where you had ascertainment and holding, where you had to cover, to your point about the legality. You'll never do legality with the press because we got this thing called freedom of the press. The legal thing will never work because it's freedom of the press. You can say anything and do anything in the press auspice, right? But there used to be for television ascertainment, and ascertainment was mandatory by law. You had to cover communities in a certain way. You had to cover Black, you had to cover disabled. That some kind of way went away. I don't know why it went away, when it went away, where it went away, but it went away. And stations used to have community development. All of that is gone. Some of the stuff that we're doing needs to go. We need to look at it in a very retrospective kind of way, because some of the good practices that we had are gone. What could happen is it could be mandatory that these newspapers, sometimes included, and these news stations have a certain percentile of Blacks, of women, of Spanish, and so on and so forth. So at least we get our perspective. But as you all know, who work in these newsrooms, you write one of these top opinion pieces, and the editor will say, but you know, we can't print it. And you're watered down. You know this. You're watered down. Your words are changed, or it goes through an edit to the point where you might not even recognize your own story.
Or you wait a year and then you publish it anyway, and you go on CNN twice the same day because it was that hot.
Somebody stole the short.
No, because I bided my time and I pushed anyway.
So, I mean, there's some real fundamental kind of things that we need to look at in this media, in these newsrooms. The other problem, and Daniel, you know this, the other problem is we are at the reporting end. These decisions are made at the editor end. So we can't just be reporting, because you can report all day long. If that editor says, kill that story, we're not printing that today, we ran out of room or whatever, then that story's dead. And if it dies on the floor, it probably won't get picked up. It's probably gone because you're off to the next murder, the next 15-year-old who got murdered in West Darby, and the next person in Inglewood. Some of these standards, we need some quality standards with these stations. But until we call it out, I endorsed a candidate, with the primaries. I made news. Every news station covered my endorsement. It wasn't the endorsement. It was how dare you endorse. That was the news. That was the real news. So I'm just saying, don't be afraid to call racism. Don't be scared to call it what it is. But that's what it is, and that's how it's going to change.
And I'll add on to that, along those same lines, we need to challenge the traditional framing of objectivity.
That's right.
Objectivity, this idea of objectivity has for so long been framed from a white-only lens, and it's what's objective to a white-only audience. We need to be striving for fairness in our coverage, but this whole, well, if I'm doing this side, I got to give equal to this side or whatever, there's right and wrong.
That calls activists for doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
Activists for doing that.
I think it's that's part of what you're saying as well, is we got to challenge that traditional framing of objectivity. I think fairness matters. We got to be fair, but we got to look in the mirror and say, hey, when they're saying be objective, what are they really saying here, right? Because it doesn't always benefit Black and brown communities. That usually harms them.
Okay, we got a few more questions. Try and make it brief, please.
Yeah, okay, my question's brief. Hi, Jackie Davidoff. So Daniel, you were talking specifically about funding for infrastructure for Black and brown led institutions, individuals, reporters. What is there any funding that is being discussed for? I mean, it's probably the white people who are the reporters who are making the comments that are dehumanizing. So is there also awareness of and current funding for initiatives that are educating journalists who are white and others, and going into newsrooms and educating around racism and white supremacy and check yourself?
Jackie, in response to your prompts, a couple of things. First, there's a lot of money, philanthropic dollars flowing into the sort of local ecosystem. It's not those dollars aren't being equitably distributed across the ecosystem. So I guess there's no money's flowing, but it's not flowing equally or equitably to the entire ecosystem. Two, I don't think enough is being earmarked for people development, like training existing reporters, editors, publishers, not just in terms of internal DEI work, but just understanding like how to bring solutions journalism as an example, sort of to their work, how to be more fair in your reporting. There are dollars flowing nationally, but a lot of that doesn't really hit in meaningful ways to local communities. Now that said, let me say some what's possible, right? I do believe that philanthropy needs to remain invested in the local ecosystem. When I say ecosystem, it's community-centered, ethnic and identity-centered media, as well as sort of the broad players like BEZ, for example. We need to stay committed to that ecosystem, but we need to build the talent and build the talent pipeline. We need to make sure people get better at what they do in the newsroom and for management. And going back to this point that Carlos made, which is profound, the advocacy that needs to be done has to be done on multiple fronts. So it's not just philanthropy. It is looking at other forms of investment. So in this country, just as an example, there are some government dollars that get pushed into public media. But that infrastructure has been eroded over time because those budgets have eroded over time. So the FCC share of those dollars. I would argue we need to not only reverse that trend, but once we reverse it, we need to radically increase the amount of public dollars that are going into local journalism entities. I see local journalism as an absolutely essential civic institution. Hasn't always done what it's supposed to. That's why we're here. But I think so we got to make it better. But we also have to make sure it's financed. And again, we're never going to come to a moment where the marketplace itself, meaning the ability to sell ads or any other type of sponsorship, is somehow going to sustain the business. Those days are long gone. There are people who challenge me on that for sure. But again, I don't believe we're ever going to out Google when it comes to journalism, right? So we need philanthropic dollars, we need government dollars, and we need community level support. And there probably still will be some type of corporate underwriting model that will still be in play. But we need to find our way to that fast. As a country, we need to find our way to that model fast. Last point, Jenna, and I'm sorry for that, but I want to bring it back home. The pipeline development is absolutely critical. One of the most disheartening bits of news for me personally, as someone who used to work at WBZ for 10 years, was when NPR, National Public Radio, in the face of a severe budget shortfall, one of the first programs they cut was the paid internship program. And I happen to know the people who built that program. And that program was built to help reporters like the ones you see here access that infrastructure, learn how to, because when I was coming up, I wanted to be a journalist. I tell this to my wife all the time, who is a journalist, but I couldn't afford to be one because I couldn't volunteer for 2 years, right? Or accept low wages for 2 years because I was helping my family back home, right? When I came out of my fancy schools. So the point is, paid internships, the first thing NPR did was cut that program, right? There should be protests right now because of that. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that point that the pipeline development is absolutely critical.
Thanks, Daniel. We have 2 more questions. We're going to ask them at the same time and address those. And then I will hand over the mic to Jamira to close this out.
Hi, North at the University of Chicago. And my question for this panel is about calling out, and it's really related, but it's about like calling out the kind of dog whistle sorts of things that are going on. Because I'm thinking right now about the mayoral election, and when they talk about crime and, with Paul Dallas and Brandon Johnson, they have different narratives, and I'm not going to get into what those are, but they're flattening, they're dehumanizing, they're making whole communities and whole issues unidimensional. And so what can we as storytellers and as consumers do to kind of affect that kind of dog whistle sort of language that's used in a dog whistle politics, so that we can really flesh out those stories?
Quickly, I have 1,000 questions.
Same here.
Yeah, we're gonna filter it down to one. But learned so much. I want to say to the panel, great. I've taught media many years, and to hear you all talk about it from a community perspective and to bring it down, bring it home, impressive. Thank you. I learned a lot. I thought that I wanted to be a journalist back in the day, like you, Daniel. And I took a political science course. All right. And after taking that course, I decided that I wanted to be a political scientist. And why? I had a couple of journalist courses, and they talked about journalism. I remember, a professor talked about if it bleeds, it leads, right? He started talking about how profit was motivating a lot of journalism, and that Black and brown people were being hurt by that. And so my question to him was, all right, so why is it the case? He says, well, you really have to understand how the American political system works. I said, I want to be a political scientist, right? So understanding how the American political system works and topic motive, and thinking about that from the standpoint of Black boys in early childhood. Stay with me, I'm almost done. Right? And thank you, Lauren, for the invitation. Black boys in early childhood through 8th grade, okay? I'm thinking about that from the lenses of some of the comments I've heard about, well, we didn't put it this way, but anti-Black male systemic racism, right? So we're not just looking at racism, but we're looking at anti-Black male racism, and we're going into early childhood and say, let's start there. Because if the American dream is real, right, it's going to start there, right? So I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts about what happens if the dehumanization narrative that started in 1619 is still present in 2023 as we attempt to educate Black males at the earliest stages of their development, and say, take that through 8th grade. What do you get specifically, and I know this is complicated, male gun violence, right? Where the perpetrator is generally a Black male. Can you talk about media? And I don't know your name, brother. Matt, I like how you broke that down, you know? And Rondell, I love your story. Is it Rondell?
Rondell, yeah.
Love your story.
I'm sorry, what is the question? I'm sorry, we're just
But
kind of running out of time.
Can you tell me how does that look? That narrative, that public narrative, that humanization narrative in early childhood, and what do we do about it?
Thank you.
So it's asking about what can you do about the dog whistling and the dog whistle politics that I guess infiltrate narratives. What can we do about that? And then take this question.
Which is about early childhood education.
Early childhood, I'm interested in what happens between early childhood and 8th grade in that narrative, that dehumanization narrative.
I get it.
Right?
Yeah, I get it. People like they're understand how it looks. It kind of like we kind of, I think we understand like how racism looks. It's like having experienced it, you know, through most of our lives. And I would say that like specifically when it comes to like the narrative around like early childhood, I think that's why it's so important to start this in schools. Why media literacy education is important in schools, because once you kind of do get this very early on, students have this program. We don't learn to think how we think about ourselves in high school. That stuff starts, you know, from preschool. So, and it kind of answers both of y'all questions. The reality is that what somebody can do, a consumer can do to you know, combat, I guess, dog whistling or like snuff it out, is all about like what you consume personally. At a certain level, a lot of this change does rely on personal responsibility, because there is the reality that like we as media creators, we decide like, you know, what we create, and like a lot of that's influenced by the power that be that we've discussed throughout this conversation. But ultimately, as an individual, you have a choice of what you consume, what you want to listen to or read or, you know, watch on television. And those are the things that I think ultimately can influence like what a child experiences in the classroom. You know what I'm saying? Because that's what that narrative kind of embodies itself. It's in the classroom for the most part. It's what they learn in school and what they experience being around peers. And so if all of that comes down to the same things we've been talking about, the fact that the point of this conversation, the fact that there is this messed up narrative, this you know, kind of fuzzy narrative, or just, I don't know, how am I wording it? But like there's a skewed portrayal. Beautiful word. But there's a skewed portrayal that happens in media that we've discussed ad nauseum. I think that's where, that's where the solution comes in. It comes in personally at that point. It comes in what you teach your kid, or what you as a teacher is teaching your students. And I think it kind of answers that same question, the dog whistle thing. It's about what you consume. You got to consume differently.
And that will influence what we choose to put out too. We're looking at what people are reading and listening to. And Carlos, Carlos had one thing that he wanted to just jump in and then.
Hello. Hey. I think to the dog whistle question quickly. I think it's very easy to make those statements and then for them to get republished. And I think as consumers, we should always demand that our newsrooms focus more on systemic issues. I mean, because we understand that racism exists and that systemic, poverty exists, and crimes of poverty lead to all the kind of dog whistles that we get. And so I think demanding that newsrooms focus on those aspects and finding ways in which to report about the systemic problems that make it so that some neighborhoods in the city have more crime than others, or that people living below the poverty line are, more likely to do certain things or whatever. Like the real story here is poverty. The real story here is the racism, the embedded kind of systemic issue here. And I think the dog whistles are trying to make you focus on this is inherent in some people, blah, blah, blah. So I think pushing back against newsrooms who republish those claims without any kind of accountability or really any kind of attempt to uncover systemic issues is important. We should push back against that all the time.
Thank you. Daniel?
Are we trying to wrap up?
Yes.
Stan, the question is a brilliant one, an important one, and I would argue that it demonstrates how important that this conversation needs to continue. The work that we're talking about needs to continue. I want to just make a critical observation. I do think there is some level of choice when it comes to what we consume and how we consume it. But I believe choice is being limited, right? Particularly when you think about social media. Everybody's following the TikTok case, for example. Our young people, they may think they're choosing what they want to see, but they're probably not, at least not 100%. So that's a whole nother forum that we need to have. But your point is right, that it's important that we have to think about the content that young boys and girls, and I know your emphasis here on boys, what they're consuming. As a father, I know that my kids are of three black boys. They're completely checked out from traditional forms of media. And they curate their own channels, at least they think they do, and through Instagram, and actually, believe it or not, I think YouTube is their probably #1 channel. And what I will say though is that because of being connected to a journalist and someone like me, their mother's a journalist, they're bringing some level of informed literacy to the work, but I think probably most are not. But again, this is important. Jamira, I know you're up. We got to pick up on that conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
So I want to thank you all, one for sticking around past time, but also for engaging in this conversation. It's very clear that we struck a chord with this conversation, but I want to add a few pieces for you all to follow up on, because much of what you talked about in this room about addressing these racist systems, about addressing the journalism industry, a lot of this work is happening in silos right here in Chicago. In the back of the room, Judith McCrae at Juneteenth Productions and DePaul University, she also leads the writer's room for the Chicago Reader Institute for Community Journalism. And that program is one that focuses on educating journalists on how to tell stories in a more equitable way. And we're in this position now where we're trying to understand how else to leverage that platform. There's also work that is happening, that we've done, and this goes back to an earlier comment of Matt's, to think about how are we engaging community members. The narrative change model that Public Narrative leads came on the heels of the civil unrest in 2020. furious, enraged about what I was seeing in the news, really trying to understand how do we use our voice and our platform to change these systems. We looked at how to address harmful narratives in public safety, health, and education through our health research project with Northwestern and identifying how to connect journalists and researchers so that they understand each other for disseminating stories in community media, in working with the Chicago Police Department and understanding how to influence positive relationships among law enforcement and community or members. On Saturday, we had a series of focus groups with justice-involved youth, their parents and guardians. The Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission rewrote their mission, vision, and value statements, and before they finalized them, they wanted to understand from the folks who were impacted by the system, are our words true to your experience? And if they are not, weigh in on that. And so this work is happening. It needs to be supported. As Daniel said, it is not volunteerism at all. There are many folks in this room who have helped to inform the work that we've done, and I greatly appreciate you all, your time, your energy, your efforts, your resources, your investment. I truly appreciate that. And I want to thank this panel for the work that you all do and how consistent you've been in your support of public narrative and the work that you've done. And then, I mean, God only knows how we wound up here, but you writing the report and then winding up at the Sun-Times, truly appreciate you and what you've contributed to this, so thank you. I know we didn't get to very many of the questions from the folks in Zoom, but we will pull those questions and respond to some of those questions in the follow-up materials that we provide. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the Trust for your support, and you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Hey, good stuff, man. Absolutely.